This is not how economic collapse announces itself. There are no sirens, no emergency broadcasts, no presidential addresses warning of imminent crisis. The systems that have governed global trade for 8 decades do not fail with drama. They fail with adjustment, small policy shifts, quiet infrastructure investments, trade agreements signed in rooms where cameras are not permitted. And by the time the pattern becomes visible, the dependencies have already locked into place. Most people believe the current global economic order is stable because it has been stable. They see supply chains as permanent fixtures, trade relationships as mutual conveniences, resource flows as market dynamics that adjust naturally to demand. This is not how leverage works. Leverage accumulates silently until the moment when one side realizes it cannot function without the other. And that moment has already passed. Canada controls something that every advanced economy requires to maintain basic industrial capacity. Not oil, not natural gas, not agricultural products that can be sourced from multiple continents. Something far more fundamental. The raw materials that make computers function, that allow electric vehicles to store energy, that enable renewable energy systems to convert sunlight and wind into electricity, that permit advanced military systems to operate beyond the limitations of previous generations. These are called critical minerals. And the term critical is not metaphorical, it is structural. Without lithium, battery production stops. Without rare earth elements, advanced electronics cannot be manufactured. Without cobalt, energy storage systems fail. Without graphite, the infrastructure of the green energy transition cannot be built. And Canada controls deposits of these materials in quantities and concentrations that no other stable jurisdiction can match. This is where the misunderstanding begins. When people hear about resource advantages, they imagine temporary market positions. A country extracts materials, sells them to manufacturers, and captures profit margins that fluctuate with commodity prices. This is the pattern that governed oil markets for a century. Producers competed. Buyers diversified sources. Price mechanisms balanced supply and demand. That system assumed multiple suppliers and substitutable products. Critical minerals do not follow that pattern. The geological conditions required to concentrate these materials in extractable quantities occurred billions of years ago. The Canadian Shield represents some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth. The tectonic forces and chemical processes that created these deposits cannot be replicated. They cannot be manufactured. They cannot be discovered through better exploration technology in regions that lack the underlying geology. This means that countries needing critical minerals face a choice that has no market solution. They can secure access to Canadian supplies through partnerships that Canada finds acceptable, or they can attempt to function without materials that their industrial base requires. There is no third option, not at the scale required to sustain advanced economies. The mathematics are straightforward. Global lithium demand for battery production is projected to increase by factors of 10 to 15 over the next 2 decades as electric vehicle adoption accelerates. Current global production capacity cannot meet this demand even if every existing mine operates at maximum output. New mines require 7 to 12 years to develop from initial exploration to commercial production. And most high-grade deposits are located in jurisdictions with political instability, regulatory uncertainty, or existing commitments to other buyers. Canada's lithium reserves in Quebec and Ontario represent approximately 40% of currently proven global reserves that meet the grade and accessibility requirements for economically viable extraction. This is not a market share that can be replaced by developing alternatives. It is a structural dependency that manufacturing economies must accommodate or face severe industrial contraction. The rare earth element situation is even more concentrated. These materials are essential for advanced electronics, military systems, and renewable energy technologies. China has dominated rare earth processing for 3 decades, controlling between 70 and 90% of global refining capacity, depending on the specific element. This dominance was not achieved through superior geology. It was built through strategic investment in processing infrastructure, while Western nations focused on other priorities. But processing requires raw materials, and China's domestic rare earth deposits are depleting faster than new sources can be developed. This creates a window where alternative suppliers can establish processing capabilities that break Chinese monopolies. Canada is positioning itself to fill that role, not by competing with China on processing cost, but by offering supply chain security that manufacturers value more than marginal price advantages. When a semiconductor company designs production facilities that will operate for 20 years, cost per unit is less important than certainty that materials will be available when needed. A factory that cannot source rare earth elements for 3 months loses more value than a decade of slightly higher input costs would have saved. This is why manufacturers are signing long-term agreements with Canadian suppliers at prices above current market rates. They are purchasing insurance against supply disruption. The same logic applies to defense industries. Modern military systems depend entirely on advanced electronics, precision guidance systems, and communications equipment that require rare earth elements and other critical minerals. A fighter jet contains approximately 400 kilograms of rare earth materials. A nuclear submarine contains over 4,000 kilograms. Missile systems, radar installations, satellite networks all depend on materials that have no substitutes given current technology. The United States Department of Defense has classified critical mineral supply chains as essential to national security. This classification was made because Pentagon logistics analysis concluded that American military capacity could be constrained by adversaries controlling critical mineral supplies. The analysis specifically identified dependence on Chinese rare earth processing as a strategic vulnerability that could be exploited during conflicts. Canada represents the only alternative source that meets American security requirements. Australian deposits exist, but shipping routes from Australia to American manufacturing centers pass through waters where China could impose blockades during conflicts. South American lithium production faces political instability and infrastructure limitations. African rare earth deposits are located in regions where governance structures cannot guarantee long-term contract enforcement. This gives Canada leverage that extends beyond commercial relationships. When American defense contractors cannot source critical minerals from secure suppliers, their production capacity becomes dependent on Canadian policy decisions. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is a present reality that shapes defense planning and alliance structures. The Biden administration's response demonstrated how seriously American policymakers view this dependency. The Defense Production Act was expanded to include critical mineral development in allied nations. This law traditionally applied only to American domestic industry. Extending it to Canadian mining operations represents an acknowledgement that American military capacity now depends on resources that American territory does not contain in sufficient quantities. But money alone does not create access. Canada has implemented export licensing requirements for critical minerals that give the government authority to review and potentially restrict sales to specific countries or companies. This regulatory framework creates leverage that cannot be overcome through payment. If Canadian officials determine that mineral exports would not serve Canadian interests, those exports do not occur regardless of prices offered. This is the structural shift that most observers have not yet recognized. For 8 decades, the global economic system operated on the assumption that resources flow toward the highest bidder. Countries with materials to sell competed for buyers. Countries needing materials played suppliers against each other to negotiate favorable terms. This dynamic assumed that supply was distributed broadly enough that no single jurisdiction could exercise monopoly control. Critical minerals have broken that assumption. The geology is too concentrated. The development timelines are too long. The substitution possibilities are too limited. And one country, Canada, holds a combination of deposits, processing capability, political stability, and strategic geography that cannot be replicated. This does not mean Canada can behave arbitrarily. Leverage that is exercised too aggressively creates incentives for others to develop alternatives regardless of cost. But leverage that is never exercised becomes invisible and loses its deterrent value. The Canadian approach has been to demonstrate capability without triggering desperation that would drive competitors toward extreme measures. The export licensing framework provides an example. By implementing the authority to restrict mineral exports, while rarely using that authority, Canada signals that access depends on maintaining relationships that Canada finds acceptable. Foreign governments and companies understand that their continued access to Canadian critical minerals requires consideration of Canadian interests in other domains. This operates differently than traditional resource diplomacy. Oil-producing nations that attempted to leverage energy exports faced coordinated responses from consuming nations that developed strategic reserves, alternative suppliers, and, in some cases, military interventions. Critical minerals do not face the same response options. Strategic reserves are less effective because the materials are consumed in manufacturing rather than burned for energy. Alternative suppliers do not exist at sufficient scale, and military interventions against a NATO member would be strategically incoherent. Instead, the response has been accommodation. Manufacturing companies are relocating production facilities to Canada to secure supply chain access. Defense contractors are forming joint ventures with Canadian partners to maintain material availability. Technology firms are sharing intellectual property with Canadian companies in exchange for guaranteed mineral allocations. Governments are adjusting foreign policies to avoid disputes that could jeopardize Canadian cooperation on mineral exports. This pattern is most visible in American-Canadian relations. Trade disputes that might have escalated in previous decades now resolve quickly, because American negotiators understand that Canada holds alternatives while American industries do not. When the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Canadian retaliation focused on products from politically sensitive districts, while Canadian officials simultaneously reminded American manufacturers of their dependence on Canadian critical mineral supplies. The tariffs were eliminated within months. European nations face even more acute dependencies. The European Union has no domestic critical mineral production at meaningful scale. Every battery manufactured in Europe, every electric vehicle produced by European automakers, every wind turbine installed in European renewable energy projects depends on materials that must be imported. And as Chinese supply chains become less reliable due to geopolitical tensions, European manufacturers are turning to Canada as the only alternative source that meets their security and sustainability requirements. The German government has signed multiple bilateral agreements guaranteeing Canadian critical mineral access in exchange for technology transfers and industrial cooperation. French manufacturers have committed to building processing facilities in Canada to secure supply chains for their home market production. These are not temporary arrangements that will unwind when market conditions change. They are structural integrations that lock European industrial capacity to Canadian resource decisions for decades. The Asian market presents a different dynamic but reaches the same conclusion. Japan and South Korea operate advanced manufacturing economies that depend entirely on imported critical minerals. Both countries have attempted to diversify sources away from Chinese control, but geographical proximity limits their options. Canada offers what these countries need most: distance from Chinese pressure and reliability from a partner that does not leverage supply for political concessions. Japanese companies have invested more heavily in Canadian critical mineral projects than in any other foreign jurisdiction. South Korean battery manufacturers have built their expansion plans around guaranteed access to Canadian lithium and cobalt. Both governments have elevated Canada to top-tier status in their resource security strategies. China recognizes this pattern and has adjusted its approach accordingly. After years of assuming that its processing dominance would remain unchallenged, Chinese officials now acknowledge that Canadian critical mineral supplies represent a strategic asset they cannot control through market mechanisms. The response has been attempts to acquire stakes in Canadian mining operations through state-owned enterprises and investment funds. Canadian regulators have blocked most of these acquisition attempts on national security grounds. The Investment Canada Act was amended to give the government broader authority to review and block foreign investments in critical mineral sectors. Chinese attempts to acquire major lithium and rare earth projects were rejected. These decisions created tensions, but they also clarified the strategic landscape. Canada will not allow its critical mineral advantages to be purchased by countries that might use those advantages against Canadian interests or Canadian allies. The climate change dimension adds another layer to this structural advantage. The global transition to renewable energy requires massive quantities of critical minerals. Wind turbines require rare earth elements for generators. Solar panels require high-purity silicon and silver. Energy storage systems require lithium, cobalt, and nickel in quantities that exceed current production by orders of magnitude. And the transition timeline is compressed by political commitments that most governments have made to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This timeline is incompatible with the development schedules for new mining projects. A commitment to install renewable energy capacity by 2030 requires minerals that must be extracted and processed starting now. There is no time to develop alternative sources in jurisdictions that currently lack production infrastructure. Countries that committed to aggressive climate goals now face the reality that achieving those goals depends on accessing critical minerals from the limited number of sources that can increase production quickly. Canada is one of perhaps 3 countries globally that can significantly expand critical mineral production within the timeframes required by climate commitments. This gives Canadian policymakers influence over which countries will be able to meet their climate goals and which will face the political consequences of failure. A country that cannot source lithium for battery production cannot electrify its transportation sector. A country that cannot source rare earth elements cannot build wind turbines at scale. A country that cannot source cobalt cannot store renewable energy for use during non-generating periods. These are not technical problems that better engineering can solve. They are material constraints that no amount of innovation can overcome without the underlying minerals. The infrastructure dimension completes the advantage. Critical mineral deposits in many countries are located in regions where transportation infrastructure does not exist. Getting minerals from remote mine sites to processing facilities and then to international markets requires roads, railways, ports, and power systems that take years to build and cost billions to finance. Canada, its critical mineral deposits are located in regions where basic infrastructure already exists or can be extended from existing networks. The James Bay region in Quebec, where major lithium deposits are located, is connected to the provincial electrical grid and road network. Processing facilities can be built near existing hydroelectric power sources, and access to deepwater ports allows direct shipping to international markets. This infrastructure advantage reduces development costs and accelerates production timelines in ways that competitors cannot replicate without massive public investment. The timeline compression matters enormously. In markets where demand is growing exponentially, being first to expand production captures market share that becomes difficult for later entrants to displace. This is not a race where all competitors start from the same position. Canada begins with geological advantages, processing knowledge, political stability, infrastructure access, and established relationships with major buyers. Competitors must overcome all of these disadvantages simultaneously while operating in jurisdictions that lack one or more of these advantages. We are watching a resource concentration that has no historical parallel. Oil production has been distributed across dozens of countries. Agricultural production spans every continent. Manufacturing has shifted between regions as cost advantages change. But critical minerals are concentrating in a single jurisdiction that possesses unique combinations of geology, institutions, and geography. This concentration is not reversible through policy changes or investment decisions. It is locked in by physical realities that no amount of capital can overcome. And the countries that recognize this reality earliest are the ones adjusting their relationships with Canada to secure access before the full weight of dependency becomes obvious. Most countries are not there yet. Their planners still view critical minerals as commodity markets that will respond to normal supply and demand dynamics. They assume alternatives will emerge if prices rise sufficiently high. They believe that dependence on a single source can be managed through stockpiles and diplomatic engagement. These assumptions are correct for most commodities. They are incorrect for critical minerals. The geological concentration is too extreme. The development timelines are too extended. The substitution possibilities are too limited. And the country controlling the concentrated deposits has demonstrated both the capability and willingness to exercise leverage that serves its interests. This is where the title reveals its meaning. Which economies collapse first will not be determined by debt levels or monetary policy or trade balances. It will be determined by which economies lose access to the materials required to maintain industrial capacity in a world transitioning away from fossil fuels. An economy that cannot produce batteries will not electrify transportation. An economy that cannot build renewable energy systems will not meet climate commitments. An economy that cannot manufacture advanced electronics will not participate in technology sectors. And an economy that cannot do any of these things will not maintain the living standards that its population expects. The collapse will not be sudden. It will be gradual contraction as manufacturing relocates to jurisdictions with secure material supplies. It will be employment losses in sectors that depend on critical mineral access. It will be reduced tax revenues as industrial bases shrink. It will be political instability as populations demand explanations for declining prosperity. And throughout this process, the pattern will be misunderstood. Commentators will blame financial policies, politicians will point to trade imbalances, analysts will discuss productivity problems. But the underlying cause will be material dependency that was never addressed because it was never recognized as the constraint that determines everything else. Canada understood this earlier than most, not because of superior analysis, but because controlling the resources made the leverage obvious in ways that depending on the resources does not. When you hold materials that others need, you see the dependency clearly. When you need materials that others hold, you find reasons to believe the dependency is manageable. This asymmetry in perception creates asymmetry in preparation. Canada has spent years building the infrastructure, developing the partnerships, and establishing the regulatory frameworks that convert geological advantages into permanent leverage. Other countries have spent those same years assuming the situation would somehow resolve itself through market mechanisms. It will not resolve, and it will intensify. As demand for critical minerals grows and alternative sources fail to materialize at required scale, the dependency will become more acute and more obvious. By the time most countries recognize the full scope of their vulnerability, the adjustments required to address it will be beyond their capacity to implement quickly. This is not prediction. This is observation of patterns already in motion. The supply agreements are signed. The processing facilities are under construction. The technology partnerships are operational. The regulatory frameworks are established. The only question remaining is how long it takes for the implications to become undeniable. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. The economies that will collapse first are the ones that maintain the longest their belief that this dependency could be managed without fundamental changes to their relationship with the country, controlling what they cannot function without. And that realization, when it comes, will arrive too late to alter the outcome. Because by then, the systems will have already adjusted to accommodate the new reality. And accommodation, once accepted, becomes permanent. This is how power transfers between nations, not through conquest or revolution, but through dependencies that lock into place before anyone notices they have become inescapable.